pleasure to be here with my guest, Jackie Shinfield, partner at Blake's. And we're here in front of the Canada Conference, the Toronto Conference on October 26th and 27th. And I think it's a pleasure to be here because I actually always enjoy seeing you, Jackie. And thank you for being here. And also, I can't imagine anyone better to set up some of the issues that are going to come up during the Toronto conference. You really are kind of the star of the AML world in terms of the whole sort of regulatory background. I'm not going to go on and on, but thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited about the conference. It's always great takeaways, great people speaking, regulators, lots of lessons learned, and it's awesome to be involved. So thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Well, so I know one of the big things that looms for this conference is the Cullen Commission report. And we're very fortunate. We're going to kick off with Austin Cullen as our keynoter. And I know that one of the things he wants to talk about is where we go from here more than just what was found wrong in the report. But talk to me a little bit about, I know you're also then going to do a panel of analyzing the report. Talk to me a little bit about, as you see, where do you expect him to go? What is going to be the federal response that's kind of called for in his report and everything?
Yeah, so his report is, the one thing about people who aren't following the Cullen Commission closely, if you're looking for AML information and information on money laundering and terrorist financing and how it's done and methods, there's so much information there that can be read and can be learned for people who are students of AML, if you will. But leaving that aside, he came to many conclusions dealing with money laundering in British Columbia, including having a special AML regulator in the province of British Columbia, imposing regulations on MSBs from the provincial level, putting more regulations on credit unions that are provincially regulated, requirements for the luxury goods sector. So if you get $10,000 more of cash, everyone has a reporting obligation, regardless of who you are. And these things are, in and of themselves, they make sense when you think about it. But I think, and I don't mean to be critical, but it fails to recognize that money laundering is not a provincial thing. It's not only a national thing, it's an international thing. It's a global issue. And to try to address it from just having a provincial response is somewhat problematic. And it gets to an issue where there's you get to more and more regulation. And just because things went awry doesn't mean the answer is more and more regulation. Now, there has been a federal response to that. First of all, FINTRAC in the last budget was given about $89 million more dollars to deal with that crime and enforcement. The federal government has committed towards working towards a beneficial ownership registry. That is happening. So there's certainly a lot moving in the federal world to try to deal with issues. When you look at the Cullen Commission reports and some of the recommendations, things like, well, there are money services businesses that aren't, registered federally that are carrying out business in British Columbia. Well, just because British Columbia has a registration regime, I don't think it follows it. Then, everyone's going to go, I'm in British Columbia, I better register. No, they'll just move to Alberta. They'll just move to Ontario. They'll just move to Quebec. So I'm not sure, there were a lot of interesting recommendations. There's a lot to be said there, but a lot of it deals with duplicative regulation, which is somewhat, as someone who acts for regulated industries in regulated entities in the industry, it's more legislation isn't always the matter, the solution. It's better regulation, more efficient regulation, really getting to the heart of the problem as opposed to piling more and more regulation on.
So let's be a little bit specific. I know that he's going to speak, and then finance is on, and I know they want to say that the federal government has a response to his recommendations. And I know you're aware of some of what's out there, but some of it isn't announced either. But what would you expect are some of the specifics when we talk about what the federal government's going to do?
Well, so they're still making up a beneficial ownership registry. One of the big criticisms dealt with real estate and money laundering through real estate in British Columbia. So this has happened before the Cullen Commission, but the federal government has announced through the Department of Finance that FINTRAC is going to regulate mortgage lenders. So right now, if you're a regulated financial institution and you make a mortgage loan, you're subject to the regime. But if you're sort of a plain vanilla mortgage broker or mortgage lender that is not a financial institution, you aren't subject to the regime. So they are bringing in there's going to be changes to the AML regime to bring in mortgage lenders. They're going to be subject to the regime. Right now, you have banks that are subject to the regime, and you also have, real estate brokers, and those who own real estate are already subject to the regime. So there are some real estate issues that are going to be dealt with. from an enforcement perspective, FINTRAC has been more aggressive in pursuing enforcement.
Particularly in real estate, there's not a lot of real estate.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it's interesting, if you look at their publicly available fines, they fall within two categories. Either an institution has sort of failed to do a few things, or the institution just has completely no policies or procedures. And so you could see from the examinations, if you look at recent penalties that FINTRAC's imposed, a lot of them are on real estate brokerages that actually the penalties, they don't even have policies or procedures. So there certainly needs to be a re-education in the real estate sector about what the obligations are, what's required. And they certainly are moving towards that in British Columbia. I know that the Real Estate Commission of British Columbia is actively involved in education. They're talking about that being a prerequisite before you can get your license, getting AML education. You know, you have that issue of people involved in the industry don't want to sort of act as cops on their clients. That seems to be a really common concern. But the AML regime will soon regulate mortgage lenders, so that will hopefully deal with some of the issues.
You do that federally too.
Correct.
So, and we talked about FINTRAC. FINTRAC comes under some criticism in the Cullen Commission report. And do you get the sense that, I mean, there's, among other things, there's how information is shared and you know, whatever. I guess I'm asking two questions. Is FINTRAC beginning to respond to some of the specific criticism? And then some of the criticism seems to me to be based on systemic things, like, for instance, the privacy laws in Canada and everything. And so I've kind of asked a bifurcated question there, like two things. What we think FINTRAC is doing, and is there something that's going to be out there to address the privacy stuff?
Yeah, so, you know, one of the criticisms or findings of the Cullen Commission was that there is a real hampering by the strict privacy laws in Canada, which doesn't allow for information sharing. It does allow information sharing among financial institutions for fraud, but fraud is a very narrow defined group. It's not AML, it's not suspicious activity. And so this is not a Cullen Commission issue. This has been ongoing for a while. And so that was one of the recommendations, that the federal regime should potentially address the ability of institutions to share information amongst themselves. And I think that's something that the federal government is thinking seriously of and looking at, because that would certainly be a huge help to institutions in Canada if you could sort of use the intelligence of other institutions with other clients to understand where you are, as opposed to spending all these resources to figuring things out. You understand from day one that you may have a potential issue. So yes, that is certainly something that I think the federal government is taking very seriously.
And FINTRAC, what are they doing? Are they doing anything internally? Are there things that they can do? I think they're anxious when they come to Toronto to address some of the things in the Cullen Commission, but what do you see?
So the one thing that you'll hear FINTRAC say, I'm sure at the conference that they talk about a lot, is that they're trying to move away from a tick-the-box type of examination regime to more of an effectiveness regime, and examine institutions by looking at not that you failed to file 3 suspicious transaction reports or that you failed to file 2 EFT reports, but rather, is your regime effective? How many suspicious transaction reports are you filing compared to another institution that's similarly situated? Like, that is sort of what they say. In my experience, that's not necessarily always the case, but they certainly talk about moving to more of an effectiveness regime. Now, FINTRAC was criticized because of the lack of cases against people that are engaged in money laundering, because there aren't a lot of prosecutions in Canada, very few.
Yeah.
And I think the one thing that's missed in that, however, is that when you find someone who's involved in criminal activity, there's a predicate offense, right? It could be narcotic trafficking, it could be a million things. And usually when you're charged with that offense, you'll have a rap sheet of 10 other things, right? It'll be trafficking, it'll be money laundering, it'll be conspiracy, whatever it is. And it's very easy for law enforcement to say, hey, if you come plea, we'll drop the money laundering offense. And that's what happens. So a lot of the criticism that there's not charges brought against, people for money laundering is not quite fair. Like, it's a lot of the intelligence that the community is gathering and providing to FINTRAC results in arrests. And just because someone isn't charged with money laundering, we're still getting criminals off the streets based on that intelligence. And I think that has to be kept in mind when you're thinking about FINTRAC's effectiveness.
And I know, there's a number of issues too around, I want to go to, because you're going to do, in addition to, you're doing a panel that analyzes the Cullen Commission report and has feedback on it and a kind of an industry view on it. That you're also looking at in one of your panels some of the payment regulation. Actually, I'm having a little the lend crowdfunding. That's the word I'm looking for. Crowdfunding and some fintech kind of innovations that became big issues during the convoy period, that some of the convoy supporters were being funded using kind of these fintech tools, including directly crowdfunding. And so there was the Emergency Act. And I'm coming to a question here somewhere, but I think all of these things kind of come together that as we are speaking and in front of the conference, there's the Emergency Act hearings that are going on. And anyway, what I was hoping you could do is kind of connect a lot of this in terms of anti-money laundering regulation and where Canada is going with that, and what we might expect from your panel on that.
Yeah, so sometimes there's an expression in law school: bad facts make bad law, and we're sort of a little bit of the way there. So just to step back a bit, historically, FINTRAC has had policy interpretations on its website that says if you're involved in payment processing activity or tuition payments, bill payments, or you're moving money where it's sort of ancillary to the main purpose of what you do, you're not a money services business, even though the definition of a money services business is very broad and includes anyone who remits or transmits funds. So crowdfunding platforms, for example, wouldn't be seen as money service businesses. Those involved in payment processing wouldn't be seen as money service businesses because they're not moving money for the sake of moving money. They're settling payments to merchants, etc. So you have that background, and then you have the truckers' convoy in Ottawa, which started as a peaceful protest and at some point morphed to something beyond that. And I think in the back rooms of government, I wasn't there and I don't know this for a fact, there was a recognition of, okay, well, we got this issue because this convoy is continuing to be funded.
Getting fuel from outside.
And it was causing huge disruption in Ottawa after dealing with the pandemic and having stores closed down. You had to close down basically, most of downtown Ottawa. For the people that lived there, it was horrific. There was horns honking. It was a lot. And so the government tried to respond. And I think at some point in the back room somewhere, it must have been like, okay, well, we deal with these crowdfunding platforms and these payment processors. So crowdfunding platforms in and of themselves, they raise funds, but they usually rely on payment processors to process the payments, right? So it's sort of duplicative, two different parties involved. And there was a recognition. It's like, at some point, we don't regulate any of these. And it was like, what do you mean we don't regulate any of these? So what they did was under the Emergency Measures Act, which is like the predecessor was the War Measures Act, like a really extreme statute, never been used in Canadian history, passed an order basically saying crowdfunding, payment processors, like report, fund, etc. And there was a recognition that there was a bit of a hole in the regime. We didn't regulate these parties. Yeah. So what they did for the first time, so our AML Act was passed, the one that we deal with now, proceeds of crime, in 2002. And for the first time since 2002, they passed an amendment to the legislation overnight, literally overnight, without any industry consultation that said, one, crowdfunding platforms are now money services businesses. And two, by the way, that policy interpretation that everyone's relied on for years and years, we hereby revoke it. So you had a situation where overnight, crowdfunding platforms and payment service providers are now subject to the AML regime in Canada without any or very little guidance as to what that means, how you comply. When you talk about payment processors and payment service providers, there's just so many different companies with so many different models that do so many different things. And the guidance, even to date, just isn't clear, and there's inconsistent application. And I mean, that's what happens when you don't have industry consultation on these sorts of things. And I understand the political environment was such that they felt they had to do this right away, but it's led to a lot of confusion and a lot of interpretations that don't make sense in terms of why are we regulating this? There's no AML risk here. And so I think FINTRAC, at least on my panel, they're going to be on the hot seat because I have a lot of questions to ask them about how they're treating my clients, about things where I get one interpretation for one model of business and another interpretation for another. And so I think FINTRAC's struggling as well. But this is really problematic for payment service providers and MSPs in general. So.
Well, it sounds like we're running out of time, and we've kind of run out of time, but it sounds like you've talked about two things. I mean, it's just going to be great to have an in-depth look at the Cullen Commission report and what needs to be done to make it go federal. And then also the need there is for some kind of regulation in this area that you talked about in terms of crowdfunding and payment processors, but one that's a little more industry aware and how the system actually works, right?
That's right.
So I guess I'm looking forward to seeing you. Thank you for stopping by today.
No worries.
And I'm looking forward to seeing you in Toronto in a couple weeks.
Perfect. I look forward to it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for watching this ACAMS videocast. I'm Kieran Beer, Chief Analyst for ACAMS. And if you've liked what you've seen, then please subscribe. We hope to see you again.